Hello, and welcome to Anaphylaxis UK's Let's Talk About Allergies podcast, where we provide expert answers to common questions about allergies and anaphylaxis. Our goal is to offer valuable insights on how we can all work together to make life easier and safer for those living with allergies. In today's episode, we're marking National Weaning Week by exploring everything you need to know about starting your baby on solid foods, from the very first spoonful to introducing common allergens safely and sharing evidence-based strategies for allergy prevention. We'll talk you through how to recognise an immediate type allergic reaction in an infant, what those early warning signs look like, and when to seek help. Joining me to guide us through is paediatric specialist dietitian Karen Wright, Senior Research Fellow in Dietetics at the University of Southampton and PhD candidate in food allergy. Hi Karen, thanks for joining us today. I thought I would just start by asking if you could give us a little bit of information on your background and what you're up to and how you got into the food allergy world.
Hi, Mary. Nice to be with you this morning. Yes, well, I'm Karen and I'm an allergy specialist dietitian. I've been working in the field of allergy for a very, very long time, both in the UK and overseas as well. I lived and worked in Southeast Asia, in Singapore specifically, for a long, long time. And then when we moved back to the UK, I've worked in the NHS in both London and Southampton. And I'm now working at the University of Southampton and I'm undertaking a PhD in food allergy.
Thank you for that, Karen. That's great. I thought I would start by asking, what is weaning? And what is the difference between weaning and complementary feeding? And after that, if you could just explain about weaning versus baby-led weaning.
So both of those terms, or in fact all three of them, are used a lot, and it can be quite confusing when in fact, most often they refer to the same thing. So as healthcare professionals, we use the term complementary feeding because it really talks about the time when a baby's nutritional needs for growth and development can no longer be met by just their milk feeds alone. So other foods need to be introduced to complement the nutrients provided by breast milk or baby's infant formula. And that's where we get the term complementary feeding. So the nutrients in the foods complement the nutrients in baby's usual milk. So at this time, babies should be introduced to a varied diet, and that's alongside their breast milk feeds or their usual milk feeds. Mm-hmm. Baby-led weaning is a little bit different, and what it basically refers to is offering a baby foods as finger foods, so foods that they can feed themselves rather than being spoon-fed. And there's no right or wrong way. I think the most important thing is that babies are offered the foods that are appropriate for them in a form that they can eat, that's safe, and that they get all of the nutrients that they need. So these foods are offered alongside their usual breast milk feeds or the usual milk feeds that they would be having. Some parents prefer spoon feeding, some prefer baby-led weaning, some like to do a bit of both.
Sure. So what is the current advice for weaning, and how do you know when your baby might be ready to start weaning?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's often one that lots of parents find quite tricky. So the current government advice is to introduce foods to your baby from around 6 months of age. And that's when you want to start to introduce a varied range of foods, as I say, always alongside their breast milk feeds or their infant formula feeds. So that includes all foods that you would normally eat as a family. And that also includes actually some of the common or all of the common food allergens at this time as well. So they should be introduced just like any other food.
So how do you know if a baby is ready?
Well, signs that your baby might be ready to start complementary feeding at around about 6 months are that they would be able to hold their head steady and stay in a sitting position or in a supported sitting position, that they can coordinate their eyes with their hands and their mouth so that they can look at food and pick it up and put it in their mouth, and that they can swallow food rather than spitting it all back out. However, that one does come with practice. practice. So a baby doesn't automatically know what to do with food when it's first presented to them. So it takes, a little bit of practice and a little bit of working out what they need to do with this new way of having food presented to them. Behaviours that can be mistaken for signs of being ready include chewing of the fists, waking up more in the night than usual, and sometimes wanting extra milk feeds.
So at Anaphylaxis UK, we do get a lot of people who are worried about introducing certain allergens like nuts or eggs to their babies for the first time. So I'm wondering what the actual likelihood is that their child might have a reaction. Roughly what percentage of young babies have food allergies?
That's a very difficult question to ask because we don't have absolute numbers. But we found that about 1 in 20 UK preschool children might develop an immediate form of allergy. So we're looking at around about those numbers.
Okay.
So it's rare for a baby to have a reaction, but it obviously can happen. But that's the number that we sort of use.
Okay, so around 1 in 20 preschool age children in the UK. And what are the best first foods to introduce to your baby? We know parents and carers may worry more about the foods that are typically associated with allergies, like nuts. So which foods should they actually be introducing first? And should they be worrying about introducing those foods that are more commonly associated with allergies?
So a lot of parents might start off with offering vegetables, such as broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, but there are no rules, essentially, around which foods you should start off with. So you could start off with any vegetable or fruit or a protein or starchy food, basically based on what your family usually eat. But to start off with, babies only need a really small amount of the solid food, and that can be given at a time that suits both the parent and the baby. Offering those first foods can really help a baby get used to a range of tastes and flavors. And especially with introducing things like the vegetables, it can help them enjoy those as they grow up, particularly if they're continually given as well. So continuing to offer the vegetables is really key to helping a baby enjoy them. Then gradually increasing the amount and the variety of food that a baby is eating. Once they're eating, a couple of small spoons or small amounts of a vegetable or any other food that they're eating, really you can start to offer those common allergens from that point. So you want to just make sure that the baby's ready for the foods and able to eat and to swallow and know how to manipulate those foods in the mouth. And that just takes a little bit of practice, maybe a few days. You don't need to do that for weeks and weeks before you start introducing the allergens. But then as soon as you've started introducing the foods and you know that your baby's ready, just get going with the allergens. That's the important thing. Getting them in early on in complementary feeding is very important for allergy prevention. Another important tip is before giving a food allergen, always make sure your baby's well. Because you want to make sure that if there is any reaction, which is very rare, but if there was, that it was due to the food and not because they were sick already. You don't want there to be any confusion about any symptoms that you see. So make sure your baby's well. And I also advise ideally starting in the morning, so you've got plenty of time to be with your baby and monitor them over the day.
Okay, and what about when it comes to how much of a complementary food you should be giving your baby each week? Can you be led by them, for example, if they are enjoying something a lot, then can you just continue to give it to them every day? Or is there a particular amount of different types of food that they should be consuming each week?
For just sort of the general foods, there's no specific amount that we suggest that you aim for. All babies are very, very different. Some take to complementary feeding really well. Others take a little bit longer to get used to foods. So just be guided by your baby. And like you've used sort of a more responsive form of feeding for milk feeds, use the same approach with feeding solids. So if your baby's turning their head away or pushing the spoon away, they're really telling you in their way that they've had enough. So be guided by your baby. I think that's really, really important.
Okay, and what dose and frequency of the common allergens are recommended?
If you've started introducing some of the more common allergens like peanut or egg, we often say to start off with a very small amount. So that might be a quarter or a half teaspoon amount. I think the most important thing is to make sure that all of these foods are always given in the right form, a suitable form for your baby based on how they're managing their foods. So, for example, if you're using peanut butter, make sure it's smooth. Look for one that on the label doesn't have any sugar or salt added, and then always thin it or dilute it with a little bit of your baby's usual milk or some water. That will make sure that it's in a form that is much safer for your baby, because peanut butter on its own can be a choking hazard because it's quite thick.
Yeah.
So you start off with a small amount, maybe sort of half to or quarter to half a teaspoon of that diluted mix. And then over a few meals or a couple of days, gradually increase the amount that you give your baby. And with the peanut butter type foods, we're often suggesting about a teaspoon 2 or 3 times a week. But obviously that must be diluted and thinned down. But if your baby isn't able to manage that amount, the most important thing is that once you've started, you keep going. So just keep offering the food and let your baby eat the amount that they can eat. Just keep it going. That's what's really important, so that the immune system sees that food regularly. That's the key to helping prevent a food allergy.
So you want to have it included in their meals each week, really, once you've introduced it. And does that go for all the major allergens, such as fish or wheat, sesame, nuts, eggs, milk?
Absolutely. Whatever of those food allergens you've introduced, the important thing, and I really can't stress this enough, is to keep that in the baby's diet. So keep it in every week. For things like the peanut and the egg, try and keep that in 2 to 3 times a week. And for other foods, just keep offering them weekly. That's really, really important.
So how should parents balance breast or formula milk feeds alongside starting solids?
So initially, the solids aren't replacing the milk feeds, they're alongside. So I would just be guided by your baby and follow your baby's lead. As I say, some babies take really well to complementary feeding, others take a little bit longer. So try not to compare your baby to your friend's baby. Eventually, all babies will eat really well and eat a wide variety of foods if they're exposed and offered that along the way. I think the most important thing is be guided by your baby and trust them to know that they know how much to eat.
So you hear about certain babies being high risk for allergies. So what means that a baby is likely to be at a high risk of developing an allergy? And how do the guidelines change for introducing allergens if you do have a high risk infant?
Very good question, Mary. So being higher risk means that some babies are more likely to develop food allergy than others. And these include babies with eczema, and in particular, eczema that started quite early on, so in the sort of first 3 months of life, or eczema that is more difficult to control, what we would call moderate or severe, or babies who already have food allergy. So perhaps that's already been diagnosed. So for those with the severe eczema, I would always advise seeking advice from a healthcare professional about before introducing the foods, but keeping the eczema under really good control is really, really important. Also think about not using skincare products on the skin which contain food as an ingredient. So that's things like maybe almond or coconut or oats. That's so that the baby's body doesn't first see the food by it being applied on its skin rather than it going in through the mouth and in through the gut. So eating the food is the way that we can prevent against allergy. And we do have evidence now that the first time a baby's body seeing the allergen through the skin may increase the risk of food allergy.
So we know with these higher risk babies that parents might be recommended to introduce allergens earlier than the 6-month guidance. So what age would this generally be recommended?
So this might be recommended from when a baby is around 4 months of age, certainly not before that. And it really is dependent upon when they're developmentally ready for foods other than their usual milk feeds. But as I mentioned, it really is based on the family, the baby, and their a sort of assessment of their allergy risks. So do be guided by the advice that you're given. One thing I would say is that just beware of online testing kits for food allergy. They're not accurate, and it can often mean that foods are avoided unnecessarily. So it's always best to discuss your approach with your healthcare professional, and make an informed and shared decision together. And that healthcare professional will take into account the individual circumstances of your baby and your family, and also the time that might be needed to wait to have allergy testing, because sometimes that can be, a few weeks or even months, and they will be able to help you weigh up whether or not waiting for that testing is the right thing for your baby or not.
So if your baby does have bad eczema, you should be in touch anyway with a healthcare professional about that,
Yeah.
and speaking to them about the weaning stage and whether you need to introduce pre 6 months,
Yeah,
if
because
they're at that higher risk level.
yeah, and that's certainly the advice that some healthcare professionals may give some parents of babies at higher risk, that they might benefit from introducing these foods earlier. Certainly, we know that delaying the introduction of these foods is not good for allergy prevention in those babies, and that starting them earlier can be very beneficial for these babies. And if you're at all concerned, please seek their advice. But managing and controlling that eczema is really, really important.
Yes, absolutely. Another question I have that we often get through the helpline is from parents who actually have allergies themselves, and they're wondering if their child is considered high risk for allergies as it is in the family, or is it just those babies who have the physical symptoms of severe eczema, for example, or an already diagnosed allergy that are considered high risk?
So, having the eczema is certainly one of the risk factors that we know of that is associated with developing food allergy, and then also having an allergy themselves in terms of the baby. Where a parent has food allergy, quite often foods might be delayed in being introduced because the parent is also having to manage their own risk of exposure to the food. And so that in itself can increase the possibility of a food allergy just because the introduction of that food is delayed. But because a parent has a food allergy doesn't necessarily always follow that the baby is going to have a food allergy as well. So again, that would be something that I would recommend discussing with your healthcare professional in the way that you can manage both things best. So keeping yourself or the other person in the household safe whilst being able to introduce those food allergens to your baby in a timely manner. However, if your baby does have eczema, it's really, really important to make sure that that's well controlled. And you could also think about applying a barrier ointment around the mouth, around the lips, the cheeks, and the neck, and that will prevent the food allergen coming into contact with the skin as well. And what's important is when you're using and applying these ointments, not to put your fingers in the pot, because any bacteria that are on your fingers might go into the pot and then you're putting that on your baby's face. But also you're not then applying the food allergen around the face. So that can really help prevent against those contact reactions. So I think for babies with eczema, make sure it's well controlled, and spoon feeding can often be a way of reducing the likelihood of the food going all over the face and the mouth, which, could increase the exposure through the skin. And as we've said already, we know that that's one of the ways that food allergy can develop.
So you definitely don't want to be delaying that introduction of allergens, even though it can be more tricky when there might be an allergy in the household already in a sibling or parent. So do you have any tips for those families who are juggling an allergy but also have an infant that needs to start weaning onto the allergens?
definitely you want to try and get those foods in, but do it in a safe way. And some of the tips that we often discuss in those sorts of situations are, considering if there's somebody else in the family that could actually feed that allergen to the baby who's not allergic themselves, or when the food allergic person is out of the house. So, for example, if they're at work or something. And if that's not possible, perhaps somebody else feeding the baby in a separate room to the person who has a food allergy, or confining the feeding to an area in the house. So maybe putting down some mats that can be lifted and washed, or some newspapers that can be thrown away, so that there's really not, sort of food left over. Feeding the baby in one place, so in a high chair, so that the area is monitored and any spills or foods that are dropped can be cleaned up immediately. You can now get some really nice food catchers for high chairs, but even things like, as I said, newspapers or plastic mats on the floor can be used to limit mess and spillages, and then they can be rolled up or cleaned or discarded afterwards. Coverall bibs really help protect clothes from spills, and then that won't be a risk for other household members who are allergic. And using different cloths for cleaning infants and perhaps a sibling who is food allergic. That way, you know if you fed the baby peanut, then you're not going to use the same cloth to clean a sibling.
Okay.
Spoon feeding can often help as well, and that prevents food sort of being smeared around the baby's face, and it also helps sort of limit spills and mess as well, so that can help reduce the contact that comes for the other person. And then obviously washing your hands immediately and baby's hands and face immediately after feeding as well, and then just making sure that all of the utensils, the countertop surfaces, are all washed with hot soapy water once the meal is complete. And then once the foods are introduced, it might be possible to then continue to give those. Once you know that the baby's tolerating that food, it might be possible to just give that food outside of the home. So you're limiting the amount of that food that's being kept in the home. But if you are giving it, at home or feeding it at all, always really clearly label foods containing that food allergen, so that it's not going to be eaten by the person who is food allergic. And then obviously keeping those foods out of reach of children. And then if the food requires preparation, and I'm thinking of things like fish or egg, then try to minimize the frequency with which they're cooked, and maybe batch cook them and keep them in the freezer well labeled, and using utensils specifically for preparing or serving those foods can be helpful too.
Amazing, Karen. Thank you so much. There's some really great tips there. As I said, that is a question we do frequently get asked when parents or siblings do have allergies. So thank you so much for all of those great tips. So what form should you use for your first feeds when you're introducing those allergenic foods? Should you be using powders or purees, for example? Or does it depend on the family?
So really it depends on the stage that your baby is at with their feeding. So if you are introducing these foods earlier because they are at higher risk of allergy and you've been advised to do that, a puree might be more suitable. And then for a slightly older baby, if you're using baby-led weaning, that can also be considered. I think that one of the first foods that comes to mind is with the peanut and the nuts. And obviously, they can be a choking hazard, and whole or coarsely chopped or coarsely ground nuts shouldn't be given to babies. I generally suggest using a smooth nut butter that you do dilute or thin, as I mentioned, with a little of your baby's usual milk or some water, or you can use very finely ground nuts and mix those into something like a sort of yogurt consistency, a puree, or another food that your baby eats really well. The important thing is that there's no bits in it, which could be a choking hazard. And spoon feeding can often be a way of reducing the likelihood of the food going all over the face and the mouth, which could increase the exposure through the skin. If your baby is not yet ready for finger foods or baby-led weaning and is having more spoon feeding, pureeing the allergen can be a sort of safer way for those babies before they're ready for the finger foods. And just Pureeing egg, for example, again with a little of baby's usual milk, is a good way of preparing that, and then mixing it with some of the foods that we spoke about earlier, like the sweet potato or the carrot or pumpkin, are really good combinations with egg there. And for other foods like fish, for example, again, if your baby's not able to manage small little bits of flaked fish yet, then pureeing that into another food would be a good way of giving that. So I think follow your baby's lead. You'll know what they're able to manage and what is safe and appropriate for them.
So how quickly can you progress through the allergens? Do you need to wait until you've introduced one allergen before introducing the next? Or is there, a particular way you're supposed to do it?
Introduce the allergens one at a time. That's really important as well, so that if there are any symptoms, it's really easy for you to spot and to know which food might have been the cause. But remember, it's rare. Those symptoms are rare.
So do you need to wait, a day between those feedings of the different allergens? For example, if you introduce the peanut butter first in the form that you were explaining you can use, then would you wait perhaps 24 hours and then introduce them to some cashew butter or almond butter?
That's a really good question, Mary. So as I mentioned earlier, I would always start with a small amount of the food and then gradually increase it. So it can be increased over a couple of meals or a couple of days. You don't need to wait 3 to 5 days between introducing foods. And in fact, doing that really slows down the introduction of a variety of foods and can really limit, the variety and the diversity over the longer term. So I think, build up the amount slowly, but not extend it over, days and weeks. I would just do it over a couple of days. And once they're eating it, continue to give that food. That's really, really important. But within a meal, just stick to one food allergen at a time, one new one at a time. And once you know your baby's able to eat that well, then you can combine them.
Okay. So if your child has already had an allergen, for example, cow's milk or wheat, then, and you know that they can tolerate it, you'd be all right to perhaps mix in a new allergen to one of those.
Yeah, I would always introduce the new allergen, on its own in a meal first, with foods that your baby's already able to eat and tolerate well. And then once you know that the peanut's tolerated without any symptoms, that can be mixed with other foods. So for example, a good way of getting in the diluted peanut butter might be mixing that with breakfast cereal. So like a wheat biscuit, for example, those combine really well at breakfast time. And that's a good, easy way of getting that diluted peanut in.
Perfect. So what if you introduce an allergen, for example, a type of nut, but your baby didn't like it and now they're refusing to eat it?
So that can happen. And what's really important is that you don't force feed your baby, and you need to consider your baby's overall feeding. So before you start an allergen, really consider how you're going to give that regularly in the longer term. Because as I've mentioned, one of the really important things with allergy prevention is that once you start something, you keep it going. So think about the different tastes and flavors that your baby likes, the different foods that you can mix that food allergen like the cashew nut butter into to give that variety. So often things that your baby is familiar with, that they've had a number of times, are foods that make it much easier to give that new food with. And for some of the foods that are a stronger flavor, like fish or some of the nut butters, introducing that alongside or with a food that has a slightly stronger flavor that can mask it can often help as well. And for things like eggs, remembering that babies' tastes aren't fully developed, so the combinations that they enjoy will be different to our adult palate. So egg mixed with sweet potato or with carrot can work really well, and the sweetness, the natural sweetness in those foods can combine really nicely with the flavor of those stronger foods, helping your baby to accept that a little bit better. Also, just think about the time of day that you're feeding those foods to your baby. You want it to be at a time when they're happy and when they're bright and when they're awake, not at a time when they're really hungry or fussy or needing a nap, because that's not going to probably go quite so well. So thinking about how you're going to continue those foods in the longer term and keep it in regularly is really important. And as I say, sometimes purees or mashed food might be easier, or spoon feeding, especially if a baby has eczema. But you might also find that keeping a note in your diary or using a meal tracker or planner, that might be helpful as well.
So how do you spot an allergic reaction versus gagging or choking when you're introducing new foods? And what should you do if you do see signs of an allergic reaction?
So I think what's really important, first of all, to know is that gagging is a normal reflex. It's your baby's natural way of protecting their airway, and it is different from choking. And remember, what we were talking about earlier is that babies need to learn how to eat, and often they gag as they're learning to move food around their mouth and to chew and to swallow. And as I've also said, some babies do take longer than others to get the hang of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Gagging is often noisy, and your baby may make sounds and will spit the food out, and their skin may also go red. The redness can be a bit harder to see on darker skin tones, but if they gag, I think the most important thing is to stay calm and to stay with your baby and just make sure that they're all right. I think the other important thing to know is that babies rarely choke. And if you're giving your baby foods that are in an appropriate form and texture, it is very rare.
And what might those choking symptoms look like?
Choking is quiet, and if they have white skin, their skin may start to look blue. And if they have darker skins, then their gums and the inside of the lips or fingernails can start to look blue as well. And choking is an important thing that you need to act quickly on and call 999.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of distinguishing that between an allergic reaction, I think, again, it's important to remember that most babies won't have an allergic reaction when they first eat a food. Most allergic reactions will happen quite quickly after eating, usually within minutes to up to around 2 hours for the immediate type of allergy. And that's why we'd suggest giving these new allergen foods earlier in the day so that you've got plenty of time to monitor your baby. So if there is a reaction, most reactions tend to be mild, and it might be swelling of the lips, face or eyes, or red, itchy, watery eyes. There might be some hives or like nettle rash, or skin rashes, or a baby will suddenly start to sneeze or have a runny blocked nose or become congested. So those symptoms are what we would say are in the mild or moderate range, and you would want to talk to your GP about them or health visitor. And obviously stop feeding the food and discuss that with your healthcare professional. But anything that's more severe, so that would be any signs that include the airways, breathing, or consciousness. So that might be that your baby has a change in their cry, or their voice becomes very hoarse, or they have a new and persistent cough, or they have noisy or difficulty with breathing, or a squeaky sound like a wheeze when they're coughing or breathing, or they become pale or floppy, or obviously if they become unconscious. Those are really important signs to do something immediately and call 999 for help. And obviously you would stop feeding your baby if there were any signs of any reaction at all, and you wouldn't give them that food again after you've sought medical help and help them recover.
And I assume you can find all of this guidance on the NHS website.
Absolutely. So have a look at the NHS website.
So what if your baby develops some redness around their mouth after eating something or introducing a new allergen? Is this a sign of an allergy? Is this something parents or carers should be worried about?
Sometimes this redness can happen after vegetables and fruits, and that's often not an allergy. It's more skin irritation, and applying some barrier ointment around the mouth can really help prevent against that contact rash. But if that has happened after introducing a new allergen for the first time, then that would be something that you would want to speak to your healthcare professional about. But if it's after vegetables or fruits, so for example tomatoes, aubergines, those sorts of foods, it's sometimes just because it's the food coming into contact with the skin, the acidity, or other types of compounds within the vegetable or fruit that's causing that irritation.
So as we spoke on earlier, sometimes people have concerns about introducing allergenic foods to their babies if they have allergies themselves, or if they think that their baby is high risk, or they've been told their baby might be high risk. So a lot of people come to us at Anaphylaxis UK to ask about allergy testing and whether they can have allergy testing for their babies before they introduce allergens. So I'm just wondering, is this a possibility, and is this generally something that is done for babies?
I think if your healthcare professional has advised you to have allergy testing, then I would follow their advice. What's important to know is what's available in your area, and it's not the same across all of the UK. And speaking to your healthcare professional will help you together to make a shared decision about what's appropriate for your child based on their allergy history, the family history, and also what's available locally in terms of testing, and also how long that testing, the wait for that, is likely to be, because you've got to weigh up with your healthcare professional and balance the time that you're going to wait against the delay that might cause with introducing food allergens. Because as we've said, in some situations, healthcare professionals may advise introducing those food allergens earlier as a way of preventing food allergy in those babies. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to weigh up, and I think it's just really important to have that discussion with somebody who knows. If allergy testing is undertaken, it should only be undertaken by someone with experience and competence to interpret those results. And in a baby who's at higher risk, it should also be performed where there is access to a service that can promptly undertake what we call a food challenge or a supervised feed, where those foods that we're sort of not clear about can be introduced within a clinical setting to make sure that it's done safely. And that requires an expert allergy service.
Thanks so much for that, Karen. I thought I would just finish by asking you what your top tips are for when parents start weaning with their babies.
Sure. I think first and foremost, it's a really exciting time and one to be enjoyed. So please make sure that you are able to enjoy that with your baby and see them developing. It's such a lovely time. And the second thing is, once you start any food allergen, start slow, build it up gradually, keep it in the diet. That's so important. So keep going, offer it regularly. And remember all of the other little tips that we spoke about too. So making sure your baby's well, their eczema's well controlled, and you do it early in the day. And then I think finally, if you are uncertain, you've got any queries or concerns, it's really, really important that you go and speak to your healthcare professional about those. You don't sit there and worry and make that delay the introduction of these allergens, because we know that delaying the introduction of food allergens, certainly beyond 6 to 12 months, is associated with food allergy. So getting them in as soon as you start complementary feeding, but seeking advice if you're unsure. And that might be through your healthcare professional or through organisations like Anaphylaxis UK with your wonderful helpline. There is help out there, and just please do access it.
Yeah, and we have that all on our weaning guide. We have a weaning page that you can visit, and we've got a downloadable guide on there where we link to the British Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology's advice for parents. Thank you so much, Karen. That's been amazing. We've loved having you on, and hopefully we will be able to have you back on again soon.
Thanks, Mary. I've really enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed tuning in to today's podcast on this very important topic. To make sure you don't miss any episodes, you can subscribe to our podcast on your favourite podcast app, including Spotify and Apple Music. Finally, be sure to follow us on social media at Anaphylaxis UK to join in the conversation, and let us know if there are any questions you would like us to answer next time.